I stumbled upon the book about sexuality in 11th, 20th century Russia. There is a piece of Tatiana Morozova's memoir that really stuck with me. In this piece, she describes how girls in the schools experience their first menstruation. You would think that information about personal hygiene and female puberty would be no secret in an all-girls boarding school, but it was. No one warned the girls. Sex education was forbidden at the time because it was considered corrupting to young girls. So the first menstruation was a public event. Other girls would laugh or be frightened or even repulsed, and those who already knew what was going on would turn away in shame. As a result, for many teenage girls, the first periods, which are stressful enough on their own, would turn into a traumatic event, a lifelong shame about their bodies, and a very persistent idea that puberty turns girls into monsters. The female body and its transformations have a peculiar affinity to horror. Images of witches, succubuses, sirens, mermaids, vengeful spirits, and women giving birth to certain demons can be found in different cultures around the world. And some of the most haunting examples of the monstrous feminine often involve radical and horrifying transformation of the body. Witches appear first as beautiful women and then turn into old hags. Vengeful ghosts present themselves as mysterious, attractive ladies to hide the reality of their already dead bodies. Or a vampire played by the gorgeous Megan Fox in Jennifer's Body turns into this when she's hungry. She's still cute though. From ancient times to the present, the female body has been seen as both sublime and terrifying. And horror as an art genre captures this ambiguity of the female body in a very eloquent way. Today I want to talk about the metamorphosis of the monstrous feminine in art, especially in body horror. The concept of the monstrous feminine has a long history and has been heavily influenced by religious, historical, and medical notions of abnormality. Throughout the history of medicine, the female body has been understudied, which has led to a number of misconceptions about women's health and anatomy. Add to this the historical control over women's bodies and the neglect of sexuality, which simultaneously infantilized and vilified women's desires, and it is not surprising that female body has been seen as both sublime and sinful. This ambiguity of the monstrous feminine has been captured by psychoanalysis and feminist scholars. A textbook example of this phenomenon of the ambiguity of the monstrous feminine is the medieval moral panic about witches. According to research by Lillian Faderman, there is a long tradition of depicting women who deviate from the traditional role of caregiver as devilish and sinful. The Witch Hammer, a medieval document for inquisitors on how to recognize a person practicing black magic, is a very interesting source in this regard. One of the most popular classes of evil monsters for inquisitors was the succubus. Succubus were believed to be women who used their powers of seduction to torment and control the men who loved them. It is interesting to note that the seductive powers of the succubus were not considered as something that women possessed independently. You could only get it by making a pact with a devil. And the succubus seduced other people not because she wanted to, but because the devil made her. I want to bring out this part because it shows how the power of seduction and desire was seen as a perversion that women were subjected to because their bodies could become a place of transgression. According to feminist scholar Barbara Creed, the monstrous feminine is based on such ancient religious notions of abominations as sexual immorality and perversion, bodily transformation, decay and death, bodily waste, and it was believed that the female body could hide these things. The monstrous feminine trope in art evokes the notion of the female body as potentially transgressive and abject. There is a manga series by Junji Ito that sums up this trope perfectly. Junji Ito in general is a genius of body horror. I mean, only a genius would turn a story about spirals into an absolute nightmare. But now I want to focus on Junji Ito's Tomie. Tomie is a series of horror stories about a girl named Tomie Kawakami who has immense power over men and sometimes women because of her magnetic beauty. But this power has its price. Tomie's appearance often drives men mad, so mad that they kill others for her or are driven to kill Tomie herself. But she is not easy to kill, as she can regenerate from any part of her body. Every time someone tries to kill her, she is reborn with more and more reasons to seek revenge. This aspect turns the plot into a vicious cycle of violence. At first, Tomie acts as someone who is reasonably motivated by revenge. But the more the manga series progresses, the more sinister Tomie becomes. The fact is that Tomie is not a single soul that constantly takes on new bodies, but a kind of vengeful virus that multiplies or even parasitizes on other people. And in order to multiply and adapt, Tomie's body morphs, and this is exactly the time when she reveals her monstrous and abject side. And these images of Tomie are the most memorable, and is something that Junji Ito does so well. The body horror. Disfigurement, various bodily wastes, terrible and maddening metamorphosis. A trap of a beautiful facade that hides something so horrible that you wish you would never seen it. And it is very telling that the more monstrous the Tomie character becomes, the more disturbed she is when someone calls her a monster or reveals her true self on photographs. For despite all her seductive powers, Tomie doesn't seem like someone who is liberated. She is in a trap. She is obsessively desired, but it seems that she has no control over this immense power. So there is a theory proposed by many feminist scholars that the concept of the monstrous feminine is simply a product of men's fears and objectification of women. But I don't really think that the monstrous feminine imagery is something inherently misogynistic. In her book, House of Psychotic Women, Kier-La Janisse suggests looking at female characters in horror in a positive light, even if they do not empower women. For Kier-La Janisse, any representation of women in horror is positive, and she proves it by showing how various female characters in horror films helped her to reflect on her own life and trauma. Horror can give language to certain psychological and physical experiences such as puberty, motherhood, and aging. I think part of the reason why horror can be cathartic for women in particular is that it often focuses on the body and its transformations. Pain and changes in our bodies are terrifying regardless of our gender. So it is not surprising that body changes and metamorphosis have been seen as something terrifying throughout history. But is transformation always a bad thing? The history of art is filled with the trope of bodily transformation and metamorphosis. We've seen it all. People turning into sculptures, sculptures turning into real people, people turning into insects, you name it. But for a long time, the literary representation of metamorphosis was not really studied in depth and seriously. In the late 1930s, Gaston Bachelard began to study the depiction of metamorphosis and its poetic power. He was particularly interested in the book called The Songs of Maldoror, written by a French author, Comte de Lautréamont, who died mysteriously at the age of 24, shortly after the publication of the novel. The Songs of Maldoror is a fascinating and eerie novel that follows an evil character, Maldoror, and his constant metamorphosis, which also affects other characters in the novel who also go through a series of transformations. What is really interesting in this book is that in it, metamorphosis is something ecstatic, This makes the songs of Maldoror very different from, for example, Kafka's The Metamorphosis, where the transformation of a character, Gregor Samsa, is a misfortune, a disfigurement from which one can die. According to Bachelard, Kafka's Metamorphosis appears as a strange retardation of life, a nightmare of impotence. I think many of the metamorphoses in Junji Ito's manga also fall into this category. In contrast, Lautréamont's metamorphosis is active, willful, rapid, and impulsive. Humans turning into spiders, leeches, vampires, werewolves, sea monsters are all facing long-awaited moment of joy and pure pleasure. It is a blissful metamorphosis. This means that the actual return to the original state is something terrible. Blissful metamorphosis gives us language to express something dramatic, uncertain, and ambiguous. For example, I began this video with a reference to the 19th century memoirs of schoolgirls going through puberty in a context where even talking about menstrual blood was a taboo. At that time, many doctors diagnosed young girls with hysteria. There was even a psychoanalytic trend among doctors to consider a teenage girl's body as a hysterical body. Girls were advised to rest more and eat healthily, which did not help at all, because what was really bothering them were the changes in their bodies, and they were so repressed that they couldn't talk about them. Such bodily wastes as blood, vomit, saliva, and other kinds of substances excreted from any human body are not something we usually talk about, and sometimes we even pretend that they don't exist. But body horror can openly talk about and show these bodily wastes, and that is why I think it can represent, for example, female puberty in a strangely cathartic and blissful way. It seems to me that in contemporary horror, female characters sometimes go through this blissful metamorphosis that Bachelard was talking about. I recently read a short story called Mantis by Julia Armfield. It is a coming-of-age story about a teenage girl who is slowly turning into a mantis. Her teeth and hair are falling out. Her skin is peeling off her bones. You would think that turning into a giant mantis in front of your peers at a party would be a terrible thing. But instead, this girl feels relief. In one of her interviews, Julia Armfield said that she doesn't see transformation as something necessarily bad, because it is also a way to become your true self. In this sense, the monstrous feminine metamorphosis can also be seen as a poetic way of contemplating one's true identity.